Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, and we're going to be diving back into on-chain analysis. Specifically, in this video, we're going to be looking at the amount of Ether supply held by addresses with between certain amounts of Ether in those wallets. Okay, so I will say that, as always, the typical disclaimer that on-chain data can be manipulated, and some things might seem more important than they are. Maybe there's some things that don't seem important, but they are. So we will talk about that here in a little bit. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. Let's go ahead and jump in. So to clarify, yet again, we are looking at the amount of Ether held, okay, in addresses between certain amounts of Ether. So this way we can break it up by certain types of investors and learn, are smaller investors accumulating? Are larger investors accumulating? What does that look like? Note that sometimes you could have one category look like it's going down, but maybe it's going down because they're reaching the next maybe they're accumulating so it looks like one category is going down, but then one above it could be going up because people are growing their stacks. But also the reverse of that would also hold true. So we're just going to take this one step at a time. I don't assume that my interpretation of the data is always going to be correct. I'm still learning this stuff as I go because I really haven't done the on-chain stuff before, but I thought it would be useful to help us navigate the cryptoverse. And I was trying to think of something else in 2022 that we could really dive into, and on-chain analysis seemed like the most fitting thing. So the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at and note that this over here, we have the supply count on the secondary y-axis and the price is on the primary y-axis on a logarithmic scale. So what is the total number of Ether held by addresses that contain less than 0.001 ETH or less than 1/1000th of an Ether? And you can see that, the amount has been on a steady incline for quite a long period of time, in fact. And there hasn't really been a whole lot of interesting things that are going on here. You have to imagine that wallet sizes that are only holding less than 1/1000th of an Ether, it could be for various reasons. Maybe they have to put in some Ether to send something else. Maybe they have a hard time getting it off the wallet because the gas fees are so high, so it's not like you're gonna withdraw it. But no, you do see it just generally increase with time. And I actually would expect this one to continue increasing and not change substantially. But what I guess some of the interesting things are the slope, the angle of attack, or the slope seems to be somewhat interesting. You can see it sloped up a lot here, going right before this started to rally. It also sloped up here as well, which was a significant move up and where it was previously. But you can see that in total today, the total amount of Ether held by wallets that hold less than 0.001 ETH is only about 8.66 thousand Ether. Okay. Now, let's go to the next level. Okay, so this is between 0.001 to 0.01 ETH. In this instance, the number of wallets has now reached about 92.81 thousand Ether if you summed up all the addresses that held between 0.001 to 0.01 ETH. Now, there is some interesting things going on here. Now, if you look back to 2017, 2018, you can see that it was more or less just a steady increase going into this, and it increased throughout the entire bear market, okay? So sometimes you'll see things go up. Just because something's going up doesn't mean the price can't go down, okay? So let's be clear about that. And one of the things I sort of had poked fun at in the past to on-chain stuff was that, it always just seems to be this up-only mentality that because some metric is going up means the price is always going to go up. That's obviously not true. You can see that sometimes on-chain data increases or a metric increases, which seems like a bullish thing, but in fact the price is going down at the time. What I find the most interesting is that you can see it actually had a pretty big dip here back right before the summer lull that we talked about, okay? And what's interesting is how how quickly we went up over here. And you can see that this started to curve off and then really started to decrease going down into this range. And I'll be completely honest with you. I mean, I personally was taking profits back over here, but I did not take any over here. Okay, so you can't win them all, that's for sure. This one seemed like a more obvious one for me specifically too, with it going up a lot in a relatively short period of time. Then we also thought that the summer wasn't going to be relatively eventful, so I think it made sense. This one over here, I did not take advantage of. But anyways, you can see that there was a pretty big dip here, and then it's been going up ever since about early August. You can see that this metric has been moving up again after these smaller wallets. It looks like there was some type of distribution going on. Again, note that my interpretation of this could also be incorrect. For instance, one of the reasons why you might see this metric go down during this phase is perhaps the people who held Ether in the amounts of 0.001 to 0.01, maybe this is going down because they were accumulating when it dropped. And so then they're now part of the next bracket up rather than say they're selling off. It could just be that they were accumulating during that time and therefore went into the next bracket, which is this one. Okay, so there's certainly different ways you can interpret this data, and it's hard to know exactly what's going on. It's hard to know, is it because they're selling, or is it because they're accumulating and going into a different bracket? There's definitely a lot to unpack. But this is just sort of an introductory dive into some of this stuff. So let's look at total number of ETH held in wallets between 0.01 to 0.1 ETH. This is somewhat interesting. I mean, you can see it was generally increasing throughout the entire bear market, but the angle of attack now, the slope, is so much higher than it was back over here. There was a sell there. Well, again, I say sell off, but it could just be because they were accumulating and then went into a different bracket. This came down here when we had this crash back in March of 2020, and then since then it's been going up a lot. It sort of slowed down over here, right, going into the summer lull, and then ever since then it's more or less just been on a pretty steep incline. So the amount of ETH held in wallets that hold between 0.01 and 0.1 ETH is now totaling about over 500,000 ETH. Continuing on, we're getting into some larger wallets now, looking at 0.1 to 1 ETH. Now, one of the reasons why I find this one interesting is because after the 2018 peak, this more or less just flatlined. Right, like this just more or less flatlined completely, despite the fact that prices were going down. So, despite the fact that the prices were dropping significantly by about an order of magnitude, maybe more than an order of magnitude, because we peaked it on 1,400 back then, and then it went back down to less than 100. Despite the fact that it did that, you can see that this, if anything, went sideways at best, but really it looks like it was a very subtle downtrend, and it didn't really pick up again until, you could really argue, after the drop back in March of 2020, and then ever since then it's been on a pretty steep incline ever since. And note that it did level off a little bit right here during the summer of 2021. We also had a dip right here into September of 2021 as well, but remember, September historically is not a great month for crypto. But since then, we've noticed it's been continuing to go up. And again, it's one of those things where this phase, you can see that there was, it's leveling off. We don't know necessarily if it's leveling off because they're accumulating more ETH in this brief bear market, and so they're going into a new category. Maybe they're then between 1 to 10 ETH. But I have to imagine part of it is because some people were taking profits, even if that's not fully representative of the entire change in the slope. Whereas you don't see that over here in the current phase, right? It's still just continuing to go up. So there's three separate things you see, right? You see this phase over here in 2017, 2018, where it basically flatlined after the peak. You see the May 2021 peak, where it did go sideways for a little bit, but not nearly as long as it did over here, and then it started its incline again. And then you see this local top, where basically it's just been continuing to accelerate through. So clearly there are a lot of people that still hold conviction in Ether and are still aggressively accumulating, or at least there's more addresses that now hold between 0.1 to 1 ETH. And you can see the total amount of ETH held in wallet addresses, in addresses that I should say, that you could have more than one address in say a wallet, but in addresses that hold between zero point 0.1 to 1 ETH, it now totals around 1.76 million Ether. Continuing on, we're looking at 1 to 10 ETH. So at the current price of ETH, you're talking about somewhere between, say, $2,500 to $25,000. So not an insignificant amount of money. Are there any useful trends there? Well, one of the things you'll note is that it did actually steadily increase going into the bear market. And so it is possible that part of the reason this flatlined is because there were people accumulating and then they made it from this category to the next one, and perhaps because it was a bear market, there just weren't a lot of new interest from, say, new market participants, so that's why it flatlined. So the people that were already in this range perhaps kept accumulating and eventually made it to this range, which you can see kept going up, and there just weren't really any new market participants to really start DCAing that were that interested, and probably that's one of the reasons why you could see it going down. But going and looking at, say, between 1 and 10 ETH, you can see that, even during the bear market, it increased. It did flatline when we reached the, that long, basically a year-long accumulation range. And then it's more or less just been steadily going up. It's been steadily going up ever since. And it did flatline a little bit during the summer lull as well. But during this one, it sort of flatlined, and now it's increasing again. So it's an interesting range to look at. Let's go to 10 to 100 ETH and see what we're talking about here, because now we're getting into some of the larger wallets. If to hold 10 ETH, you're talking about at least $25,000, but up to 100 ETH, $250,000. So this is not, this is some serious money that we're talking about. So what's going on there? Well, in the bear market, you can see, it increased in the bull market, and then in the bear market, it increased, but not nearly as much. Okay. And then there was this distribution phase. I would probably consider this, a distribution phase. I was taking profits on my Ether. I think the idea that you hodl forever is not the best advice. I do think taking profits is key. Again, no one's perfect in terms of taking profits on every major move, because I took profits in this first one. I did not in the second one. So, some people ask me, did you sell Ether over $4,000? And my answer is, well, yeah, but when I did it, it was actually back in May of 2021, not in November. So, it is what it is. When you see an asset, for me, when I see an asset go up, from $100 to $4,000, it's hard to not take profits. Because you're talking about a 40x move, right? A 40x move. But then to go from 2,000 to 4,000, it's only a 2x move. So I wasn't as inclined to take profits. Okay. So again, I'm not sharing this to just say, oh, look at me, I got it wrong. But just to say, well, look, I'm an investor in Ether, and I looked at this phase over here as a distribution phase. But I didn't really look at this other one as one, even though in hindsight, it is at least a local top. It just is what it is. You can't, if it's dropping 50%, it's at least a local top. Okay. So what you have seen though is I would argue this was a distribution phase going into the summer lull. We had a feeling that was coming, and then ever since then, it's more or less just flatlined, right? This is mostly just flatlined here, and we haven't seen a surge yet. I would be inclined to think that a future move by Ethereum to say $10,000 or $15,000 or something like that would likely need to be accompanied by some of these larger wallets starting to hold more Ether again, because you can see the total amount of Ether held by wallets that hold between 10 and 100 ETH has basically been right around 6.5 million ever since March of 21. So it hasn't really changed a whole lot. It would be nice to see that going up again. But one of the things I do think is worth mentioning is you also have to consider that as the price goes up, it will be harder and harder for people to obtain these larger amounts of Ether. So there'll just be fewer people that will be able to afford between 10 and 100 ETH when the price is, say, just ranging at around $2,500. Whereas in the bear market, when the price was only $100, it wasn't so hard to get 10 ETH, you're just talking about $1,000. Which, I mean, I'm not trying to minimize that $1,000. I mean, $1,000 is definitely a decent sum of money. But the point is that there's a lot more people over here that could have afforded to, say, put $1,000 and get 10 ETH. But now to get 10 ETH, you'd have to put in $25,000. So it does make it a lot harder for the average retail investor. Continuing on, if you look at it between 100 to 1,000 Ether, what do you notice? Well, you notice a fairly systematic uptrend in the bull market of 2016, 2017. And then you notice that it basically flatlined for the accumulation phase. And it sort of went up a little bit. And then you had this like monstrous distribution phase during this part over here. So the demand was just incredibly high because it was basically offsetting all this, what I'm guessing is selling pressure that really started to take place when Ethereum broke through about $500. You can see that the amount of ETH held in wallets of this size really started to go down. Now, you could always argue that maybe it went down because they were accumulating more and they got to over 1,000 ETH and therefore they went into the next category. But I would argue that a lot of this was systematic selling. And that's why you see it precipitously drop back down to the same levels it was at during the accumulation phase over here. And we're basically at those same levels again. And it's the supply held of Ether held in wallets that range between 100 to 1,000 ETH has basically been sitting just shy of 10 million ever since the summer of 21. So continuing on, we'll go look at 1,000 to 10,000 ETH. What do you notice? Big uptrend, even after the peak of 2018, even after the peak. And it continued to go up until about August of 2018, which is fascinating to think about, that, there were definitely a lot of big players accumulating even during that time. I mean, from the peak, the amount of Ether held in wallets that held between 1,000 to 10,000 ETH was only around 17.88 million. But by August, it was sitting at about 20.11 million. So an additional 3 million ETH or so accumulated in wallets that held between 1,000 to 10,000 ETH over the course of, say, the first, half or so of the bear market. And then it started to go down. And so, I mean, either they split their Ether up into separate wallets, either they continued to accumulate ETH and then went into the next band, or perhaps some of them lost faith and decided to capitulate, right? There's a lot of different reasons, and you have to consider that we can't fully know all the reasons just by looking at it. My guess is it's a combination of all three. But then what you see is a flat line. And then again, I think this is a distribution phase that took us into the peak right here. So I think this is more or less a distribution phase. And you can see that it really started to flatline after the peak, right? So people were selling into this, I think, okay? And then it's more or less been flat. It actually did pop a little bit a few days ago from about 4.2 million up to about 4.61 million, but now it's come back down to about 14.3 million. So not a whole lot of change since April of 2021. This hasn't really changed that much, okay? So again, it's going to be harder and harder for people to find themselves with addresses that have between 1,000 to 10,000 ETH, especially now that the price of Ether is over $2,500. Continuing on, we'll look at 10,000 to 100,000 ETH. It looks interesting. It really does sort of look like the price chart in a way. And if anything, though, it's maybe a lagging indicator, right? Like maybe it's a lagging indicator. Like if you look at the price peak happened after the supply count of between 10,000 to 100,000 ETH. The price bottom occurred before, you could argue, this bottomed. Additionally, over here, this peaked before the supply peaked and held them in these wallets. And then basically, it's actually interesting because even September of 2021, you can see it popped and then it sold off. The amount of Ether held in these wallets reduced some since then. So it dropped from about 30 million or so down to about 28.46 million. And then most recently, it's actually entered a very brief uptrend. If we zoom in, you can see what I'm talking about. So wallets that held between 10,000 to 100,000 ETH were decreasing during this local distribution phase over here. And as of December 29th it started going back up again as of December 29th. That has not stopped the price of Ether from dropping since then. I'm just noting what's happened on this chart. And then if you look at 100,000 to a million ETH, you can basically just see it's been in full decline since since the end of 2019, which I think makes sense. I mean, it's certainly going to be harder and harder for entities to hold between 100,000 to 1 million Ether with the price as high as it is. And then finally, looking at over 1 million ETH, it's actually going up, right? It's actually going up. Again, you're probably more or less talking about exchanges, those types of things. But actually, the total amount of supply held by addresses with at least 1 million Ethereum, with 1 million Ether, has basically been increasing from about 7.53 million total Ether held in those wallets in late 2019 to today. It's about 26 million Ether total held in wallets if you sum them up that held at least 1 million Ether. So on a fairly steady incline there. Whereas, during the bear market, this was more or less just flat. Hopefully this is interesting. Look, I mean, I know some of this stuff is dry. I know that presenting a lot of the on-chain stuff isn't exactly, it's not exactly going to get the most views. It's kind of boring, right? Like, who wants to sit here and take 20 minutes out of their day to just look at stuff going on, especially when it doesn't really seem to affect the price in the short term. But I also think there are at least a few people out there that find this stuff interesting. And with crypto, I mean, crypto's been in a downtrend now for about 2.5 months, okay? And there's only so much we can say. I mean, like, it's just a downtrend until proven otherwise, right? Like, what else do you want me to say? So we're trying to mix it up a little bit, provide some on-chain analysis, and see if there's anything interesting. So hopefully you guys found something interesting in it. I know the on-chain analysis definitely does get mixed reviews, and also I know my interpretation of on-chain analysis can also get mixed reviews, but I do think the criticism is justified. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. If you guys want access to all these charts, check out intothecryptoverse.com. You'll get access to this, as well as a lot of other things. We have the risk dashboard, the Telegram alerts channel, the Telegram chat room, the weekly reports. We do 3 premium videos each week. You get access to all of these on-chain charts and a lot of ROI charts as well, and logarithmic regression charts. You get access to a whole lot of stuff. So check it out if you're interested, and you can find a link to that in the description below. Okay, so thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, click the bell icon to turn on notifications, give the video a thumbs up, and I'll see you next time.